1948. Comics were literally in auto-da-fés, in courtesy of librarians, churches, and parent-teacher organizations. It led to a kind of censorship of comics that was quite draconian, because among all this kid literature, as you saw that kid standing in front of the newsstand, there were these things, and parents were unhinged by Tales from the Crypt and crime suspense stories. They didn't think it was so good for the kids. It was somehow a seduction of the innocents, as Frederick Wertham, the psychiatrist, who didn't call his book The Pernicious Results of Comic Book Reading on Childhood, but a sexier title. When he saw a book like this, he saw only the injury to the eye motif, where when I got hold of these comics, I saw it as a metaphor for how comics work. They get past your critical radar and burn their way directly into the brain. Most people saw it like Wertham at the time, and it led to that kind of comics code seal that was necessary for comics to be distributed in the shops, and a kind of denaturing of what comics could be, so that the field was ceded to television as the new mass medium, and to, as one comic book put it, too many superheroes. But while all this was going on, including the auto-da-fés, there was this other current of comics, which is what we got interested in together to make this book. It was those comics that were nominally comics for young children, right? They managed to go ahead unscathed through the comics code. Like the comic book publisher of those two books, Dell Comics, was able to not have to worry about being burned and wiped off the newsstands, although I'm sure there was some Dell comics in the pile because all comics were painted with the same brush. But Dell didn't subscribe to that comics code that allowed books to be distributed, because they had their own very powerful distribution system. They had a Dell pledge to parents. In the comic code hearings in the Senate, the vice president of Dell Comics said, "We're not interested in controlling the pernicious content of comic books. We're trying to eliminate the pernicious content and present wholesome comics for kids." They took their job as guardians of the culture relatively seriously. Sometimes it led to rather squeaky, boring licensed comics, but sometimes, as in the ones I just was showing, like the Donald Ducks, you really got an amazingly complex and interesting set of comics, whereas at the same time that you had these serious guardians of kid culture, you also had the funny uncles who would take, like the guy who did Lucky Duck, How to Shoot Ducks, having a duck committing suicide, who would think that a good entertainment for kids usually consisted of showing a funny animal whoring and going out all night into a poker game, you know. So there was a spectrum of what was available in kid comics as we began to explore these things. But comics like Carl Barks's Donald Duck is not the same as the Donald Duck who was the choleric quacker of the animated cartoons. He built a very convincing world that had a rather acerbic quality and very nuanced characters. You know, Donald Duck, as portrayed by Carl Barks, as we found and chose for our collection, had far more nuance than Superman, Batman, or Spider-Man and beyond. Here you have Donald having gotten even with his lucky cousin Gladstone Gander by sending him on a wild goose chase to the North Pole, and he wakes up unable to sleep, and then he chortles over having done this, and then bit by bit begins to feel worried about the consequences of what he's done by sending Gladstone off into the Yukon unprotected, and begins to feel guilty, worried, and finally really oppressed by the thought of Gladstone being eaten by a polar bear or something. That's a very amazing spectrum of emotion to happen on a page of comics, and something that Barks was a master of. The Dell comics included the amazing things like Pogo and the fairy tale comics that Walt Kelly did when he fled from the Disney studios during the years of the animation strike and reinvented himself as a comic strip artist. And when we were putting the book together, we found that certain artist-writers kept floating to the top as this story is better than anything else we're finding, and we allowed those artists to occupy about 50% of the book while making room for the funny uncles who would present some of the weirder things that kids could still like after we filtered for racist, sexist, and peculiar content that wouldn't make this a likely book for kids. Because, you see, when we did this thing, we were looking to make an anthology for kids, even though we know that most kids don't have $40 or whatever it's discounted to at the Strand available. But we're hoping that librarians and parents could buy a real treasury, something that involved us really sifting through all this stuff to find the stories that could hold their own against any children's literature from the middle of the century. And although adults are invited in and scholars of comics are invited in, it's really organized not around the auteurs, the artists. They keep showing up in different sections of the book. We divided it in a kid-friendly way with these arbitrary chapters like Hey Kids, Comics for Kids, that allowed for us to do things like show Sheldon Mayer's work. Sheldon Mayer did, his best-known creation was something called Sugar and Spike for DC Comics. Much more sophisticated, I thought, than a lot of the Flash comics I was reading as a kid. Here, these two kids can talk to each other and understand each other in their baby talk as they negotiate the adult world, but adults can't understand them. This was a generation or two before Rugrats. Here, Sugar and Spike are looking at a checkers game, not quite understanding it, but they're trying to learn how to play from having watched grown-ups, and they're moving these little wheels around. And then over here, Spike manages to jump over and say, okay, now what? Now you take all my wheels.